8 most terrible years to be alive. 1346. The Black Death. The Black Death wiped out 26% of humanity. The bubonic plague pandemic lasted for 7 years. Over this period, it spread across Afro-Eurasia. It killed up to 60% of all Europeans. In China, it wiped out about half the population. The global population fell from 475 million to 350 million. 1918. World War I and the Spanish flu. It was the last year of the war. The war itself cost 16 million lives. Europe lay in ruins and the global economy was teetering. Then the flu outbreak began. This deadly pandemic took up to 100 million lives. Soldiers returning from the war spread the virus to America. 1945. Atomic bombings. This was the last year of World War II, but it wasn't all that joyful for similar reasons to 1918. A worldwide famine began as the war had disrupted food production. Millions of people starved, and millions more were displaced. In August, the US dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. The cities Hiroshima and Nagasaki were leveled. This resulted in at least 130,000 casualties. A month later, Hiroshima was struck by Typhoon Ida. 1816, the year without a summer. That year Mount Tambora in Indonesia erupted. It was the most powerful supervolcanic eruption on record. Ash from the Dutch West Indies dispersed around the world. It killed off much of the crops. 10,000 people lost their lives in pyroclastic flows. Contaminated water and crop failures caused 100,000 more deaths. The entire world was covered in snow. The ash and dust in the air reflected sunlight. This caused global temperatures to plummet. 1929. The Great Depression. The Depression was followed by a global recession. Between 1929 and 1932, worldwide GDP fell by 15%. This caused unemployment and widespread poverty. Construction was virtually halted in many countries. Farming communities suffered as crop prices fell by 60%. There were no government handouts to the jobless. Many of them became homeless, living in shanty towns. In the US, tenant farmers and sharecroppers were hit the worst. Immigration from the US increased for the first time in history. 1666, Plague and Fire. This was an especially bad year for England. The Great Plague struck London in 1665. It was the last great outbreak of the bubonic plague, but it was also devastating. In just 18 months, London lost nearly 25% of its population. People were fleeing the capital en masse. In September, the Great Fire of London broke out. The fire destroyed the medieval city of London. 80,000 people were left homeless. 1520. Mega drought. 1520 and 1521 were particularly tough for North America. A mega drought in Mexico resulted in a widespread famine. 7 million people died of malnutrition. On top of that, smallpox and measles started to spread. These diseases had been brought by Europeans. Native Americans had no resistance against the overseas strains. Of course, nobody at the time knew this. It must have seemed like a punishment from the gods. 1958, the second 5-year plan. This horrible period was limited to China, but in terms of human deaths, it was one of the worst. Mao Zedong imposed crop quotas on peasants. This led to the Great Chinese Famine, the largest starvation in history. Up to 55 million people lost their lives within 5 years. Meanwhile, ruthless political persecution continued unabated. Forced labor and public shaming became commonplace. At least 2.5 million people were executed by the Red Guard.